The crystal chandeliers of the Vanguard Technologies Company gala cast prismatic light across 500 faces, but none shone brighter than Rebecca Morrison's, the woman every executive believed was simply Jacob Morrison's trophy wife, unaware she was the secret owner of the $5 trillion tech company he worked for. She stood near the champagne fountain in her emerald gown, watching her husband of 8 years grip a manila envelope with white knuckles, but she had no idea those papers would shatter the carefully constructed life she'd built in shadows. Jacob's secretary, Amanda Pierce, clung to his arm with practiced intimacy. Her red dress, a declaration of war Rebecca hadn't known was coming, but the battlefield had been chosen without her consent. The envelope emerged from Jacob's jacket pocket as he approached his wife, his face cold with manufactured resolve. But what he couldn't see was the empire crumbling beneath his feet with every step. He handed her divorce papers at the company gala to marry his secretary, the words leaving his mouth like bullets aimed at her heart. But he had no comprehension that the target wore a crown, invisible to his ambitious eyes. Rebecca's fingers trembled as she accepted the documents, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences. But one question burned brighter than her humiliation. What would she do with the power he didn't know she possessed? Would she reveal the truth that very night, crushing his career in front of the colleagues he'd spent years impressing, but risk exposing the secret that had protected her company for a decade? Could she watch him walk away with the woman who'd schemed to take her place, but maintain the anonymity that had allowed Vanguard Technologies to flourish without the scrutiny her gender would have invited? Would she choose revenge swift and public, or would she orchestrate something far more devastating, but infinitely more precise? Rebecca Morrison had learned the art of invisibility long before she became a billionaire. Standing in the grand ballroom of the Northbrook Hotel, she embodied that skill perfectly, but every executive in the room would have collapsed if they'd known the truth. Her emerald Valentino gown, purchased with her own money from an account Jacob knew nothing about, hugged her curves with elegant simplicity, but she'd chosen it specifically to fade into the background of more flamboyant displays. Amanda Pierce's red dress, for instance, screamed for attention 3 tables away. But Rebecca had never needed to scream. She'd learned to whisper and watch the world lean in to listen. The gala celebrated Vanguard Technologies' latest breakthrough, a quantum computing chip that would revolutionize artificial intelligence. But Rebecca felt no pride in the achievement she'd personally funded. Jacob stood at the bar, laughing with his colleagues from the marketing department, but his eyes kept drifting to Amanda, with the hunger of a man who believed he deserved more. More beauty, more youth, more admiration, but never more responsibility than his comfortable senior marketing director position provided. He had no idea that position existed because his wife had created it for him 7 years ago. "Mrs. Morrison, you look radiant tonight," said Gerald Patterson, Vanguard's CEO, a man who reported directly to the anonymous shell corporation that actually owned his company, but who believed he answered to a reclusive tech mogul named R.M. Sutton. "Your husband must be so proud of tonight's announcement." Rebecca smiled with practiced warmth, but her mind calculated the irony of his words. "Jacob's contributions to the marketing team have been valuable," she said, each word technically true, but hollow as a drum. Gerald nodded enthusiastically but moved on to more important guests: senators, venture capitalists, tech journalists who could amplify Vanguard's success, but who would never know they were amplifying her vision. Rebecca had orchestrated this evening down to the smallest detail, from the menu to the guest list to the lighting that made the quantum chips display look like captured starlight, but she would receive no credit and wanted none. Credit meant scrutiny, but scrutiny meant questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, a message from Thomas Wu, her actual attorney, not the divorce lawyer she'd someday need, but the man who'd helped her build the legal fortress that protected her identity. The message was brief. Stock price up 47% on the announcement. Your net worth just increased by $340 billion. Congratulations, boss. She deleted it immediately, but allowed herself 3 seconds of satisfaction before returning her face to its neutral mask. Across the ballroom, Jacob was making his move, but Rebecca couldn't see it yet. He'd excused himself from his colleagues with a joke about needing liquid courage, but the envelope in his inner jacket pocket contained no humor. Amanda had helped him rehearse his speech for 2 weeks, but both of them had underestimated the woman they were about to devastate. Rebecca watched her husband approach with mild curiosity, but assumed he wanted to leave early. He always found these corporate events boring, despite the fact that his paycheck depended on them. His face carried an expression she couldn't immediately place, something between determination and fear, but she'd grown so distant from him emotionally that reading his moods had become difficult. "Rebecca, we need to talk," Jacob said, his voice low, but several nearby executives turned anyway, because gossip was currency in corporate America. "Here?" she asked, glancing around at the crowd, but already knowing he'd chosen this public venue for a reason. "Here," he confirmed, but his hand shook slightly as he pulled out the manila envelope. "I'm done pretending, Rebecca. I'm done with a marriage that's been dead for 3 years." The words hit her like ice water, but she kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. 3 years. She'd thought they were happy 3 years ago, but apparently she'd been building a tech empire while her marriage crumbled unnoticed. "You're divorcing me at your company gala." The irony of those words, his company, would have made her laugh if her heart wasn't fracturing, but she maintained her composure. "It's the only time I knew you couldn't make a scene," Jacob said, but his logic was flawed because he didn't know what she was capable of. "I'm in love with Amanda. We've been together for 18 months, but I couldn't keep lying to you anymore." 18 months. But Rebecca's mind calculated backward through business trips and late nights at the office that she'd never questioned. 18 months of betrayal, but she'd been too focused on a product launch in Singapore to notice. 18 months of building a future with another woman using the salary and benefits Rebecca's company provided, but the cosmic justice of that fact gave her no comfort. "Amanda Pierce, your secretary?" Rebecca's voice remained steady, but her fingers crushed the envelope's edge. "She's not just my secretary," Jacob defended, but he was already diminishing the woman he claimed to love by reducing her to a title. "She's brilliant and ambitious, and she actually sees me, Rebecca. She doesn't just tolerate me." The accusation stung because it carried truth, but not the truth Jacob believed. Rebecca had tolerated him, tolerated his mediocrity, his lack of vision, his comfort with middle management while she built empires in secret, but she'd done it out of love for the man he'd been in college, not the man he'd become. "I'll sign them," she said quietly, but the words carried a finality that should have warned him. "But know this, Jacob, you have no idea what you're walking away from." He laughed, but the sound was bitter with misplaced confidence. "I'm walking away from a marriage to a woman who inherited her money from her grandmother and never worked a day in her life. I'm walking toward a woman who understands ambition." Rebecca's inheritance story, the grandmother who'd supposedly left her $50 million, was a fiction she'd created to explain her wealth. But Jacob had believed it without question because he'd never looked deeper. He saw a trust fund baby who spent her days shopping and lunching, but missed the 16-hour workdays she conducted from her home office while he was sleeping. "I see," she said, but she saw so much more than he could fathom. "Amanda's waiting for me at table 12, Jacob continued, but Rebecca didn't turn to look. "After tonight, she'll be known as my girlfriend. After the divorce is final, she'll be my wife." "How romantic," Rebecca said, but her tone could have frozen nitrogen, a company gala proposal built on the ruins of our marriage. Don't be dramatic, Jacob said, but he was already turning away, already dismissing her, already walking toward the woman in red, who represented everything he thought he deserved. Rebecca stood alone near the champagne fountain, but she was the least alone person in the room. She controlled the building they stood in through a subsidiary corporation, but nobody knew. She controlled the company that employed 45,000 people globally, but her anonymity was absolute. She controlled Jacob's entire professional existence, but he'd just handed her divorce papers without the slightest awareness of the power imbalance. Gerald Patterson appeared at her elbow with concern creasing his face, but his worry was for appearances, not her well-being. "Mrs. Morrison, is everything all right?" I couldn't help but notice Jacob looked upset. "Everything's fine," Rebecca lied, but she was already formulating a plan that would redefine fine for everyone involved. "Just a personal matter we'll handle privately." Of course, Gerald said, but his attention had already shifted to a senator approaching with his entourage. "If you'll excuse me." Rebecca excused him with a nod, but her mind was racing through options with the same analytical precision she applied to quarterly earnings reports. She could reveal everything right now, climb on stage, announce her ownership, destroy Jacob's reputation in front of 500 people, but that would be crude and emotionally satisfying for approximately 5 minutes. She could wait and handle this through lawyers, let Jacob walk away with his dignity intact, while she rebuilt her personal life in private, but that felt like rewarding his betrayal. Or she could do what she'd always done best, think strategically, plan meticulously, execute flawlessly, but with a creativity that would make this moment legendary. She pulled out her phone and texted Thomas Wu. "Emergency meeting tomorrow, 6 a.m. Prepare documents for immediate corporate restructuring. Also, I need a divorce attorney. The best." His response came within seconds. "On it. Are you okay?" She typed back, "I will be." But she didn't believe it yet. 10 years earlier, Rebecca Chen, she'd taken Morrison as her married name, sat in a Stanford University computer lab at 3 in the morning, but exhaustion meant nothing compared to the breakthrough crackling through her neural network code. "It's working," she whispered to her roommate Jennifer Lee, but Jennifer had fallen asleep at the adjacent terminal hours ago. "The pattern recognition is actually working." Rebecca's doctoral thesis in artificial intelligence had consumed 4 years of her life, but the algorithm she'd just created would consume the next decade of tech development. She'd solved a problem that had stumped researchers for 20 years: how to make machine learning systems actually learn like humans, with intuition and creativity, but without the computational overhead that made previous attempts impractical. The algorithm was beautiful in its elegance, but terrifying in its implications. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jacob, her boyfriend of 2 years. "Still at the lab? I made dinner. Come home?" She'd met Jacob in an undergraduate economics class, but what had attracted her wasn't his academic prowess. He was solidly average, but his kindness and stability. He was pre-med then, planning to become a pediatrician like his father, but Rebecca had seen something else in him, a good man who would support her dreams without competing with them. She'd been wrong about that last part, but wouldn't discover it for years. "Be there in 20, she texted back, but she was already saving her code to 3 separate encrypted servers she'd built herself because she trusted nothing to the cloud. Jennifer stirred awake, but her eyes widened when she saw Rebecca's screen. "Did you actually solve it, the recursive learning problem?" "I think so," Rebecca said, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead. "But Jen, if this works the way I think it does, it's worth billions, hundreds of billions. The patent alone could make you the richest woman in tech," Jennifer finished, but her expression turned serious. which is why you need to be very careful about who you tell. Remember what happened to Melissa Huang? Rebecca remembered, but the story haunted every woman in their program. Melissa Huang had developed a revolutionary encryption algorithm, but her male advisor had claimed credit, patented it under his name, sold it to a defense contractor for $200 million, but Melissa had received nothing except a footnote in his paper and a lesson about trust. "I'm not telling anyone," Rebecca said, but even as she spoke, she knew the isolation that decision would require. "I'm going to develop this privately, patent it under a shell corporation, build a company without putting my face on it." "That's paranoid," Jennifer said, but her tone suggested she thought it was brilliant. "That's strategic," Rebecca corrected, but she was already mentally designing the corporate structure that would protect her creation. The tech world isn't kind to women, especially women who outshine men. If I want to actually build something lasting, I need to be invisible. She went home to Jacob that night, but didn't mention her breakthrough. They ate reheated pasta and talked about his MCAT scores. Good, but not great. And she listened with genuine interest, but part of her brain was calculating the costs of incorporating in Delaware versus Nevada. 2 weeks later, she filed patents under the name R.M. Sutton, a combination of her mother's maiden name and her grandmother's, but attached to a corporate entity that led back to nothing. 3 months after that, she defended her dissertation with a simplified version of her algorithm that was impressive enough to earn her doctorate, but crude enough that nobody would recognize its commercial potential. "Dr. Chen, your work is solid," her committee chair said, but his praise was perfunctory. "Have you thought about what's next? There are several postdoc positions available, though I should warn you the funding is limited." What came next was $500,000 of venture capital she'd secured from an investor who thought he was funding a promising male entrepreneur. She'd used a voice modulator for all phone calls and a male stand-in for the single in-person meeting, but her business plan had sold itself. "I'm taking a position in industry," she told her committee, but the industry she was entering was her own creation. Jacob proposed 3 months after her graduation, but his timing was terrible because Vanguard Technologies was consuming every waking hour. She said yes anyway, but the engagement ring, a modest diamond he'd saved 6 months to afford, sat on her finger while she wore industrial-grade gloves in the clean room she'd rented to build her first quantum processing prototype. "I love you," she told him the night he proposed, but she meant it even though she was hiding something massive. "You make me feel safe in a way nobody else ever has." It was true, but safety would prove to be a poor foundation for a marriage built on secrets. They married in a small ceremony in his parents' backyard, but Rebecca wore a dress she'd bought with her first $10 million in revenue. Not that Jacob knew Vanguard existed yet. She'd told him she was consulting for tech companies, contract work that paid well but required discretion, but he'd never asked for details because he was consumed with his own career pivot. He'd failed the MCAT twice, but decided medicine wasn't his calling after all. Marketing seemed more appealing, creative, lucrative, less stressful than life-or-death medical decisions. But Rebecca could see his confidence cracking with each professional redirection. "I've got an opportunity for you," she'd said 6 months into their marriage. But she'd carefully laundered the offer through a recruiter so it wouldn't seem suspicious. Vanguard Technologies is hiring for their marketing department. It's a tech company doing innovative work in AI. I think you'd be perfect. He'd interviewed, but the fix was already in. Rebecca had instructed Gerald Patterson, the CEO she'd hired, to offer Jacob a position with excellent pay and minimal expectations. The salary was $180,000 annually, but worth it to keep her husband happy and unaware. "I got the job," Jacob had announced, but his excitement was genuine and heartbreaking in retrospect. "Senior Marketing, Director at Vanguard. Rebecca, they're paying me more than I ever imagined. We're going to be comfortable now." We were already rich, Rebecca thought, but she'd smiled and celebrated and pretended his salary mattered to their financial situation. Over the next 7 years, Vanguard Technologies grew from a 20-person startup to a 45,000-employee global powerhouse. But Rebecca orchestrated every major decision from behind her R.M. Sutton persona. She attended board meetings via video with her face obscured and her voice modulated, but her vision was crystal clear. She made investments that seemed risky but paid off spectacularly, but always credited her team's insights rather than her own. She became the invisible hand guiding a $5 trillion empire, but Jacob came home every night and complained about his middle management frustrations without the slightest awareness. "Patterson's an idiot," he'd say over dinner, but Patterson was implementing Rebecca's strategy perfectly. He approved a research budget that's way too aggressive. "We're going to hemorrhage money." That research budget would yield the quantum chip they were celebrating tonight, but Rebecca just nodded sympathetically and poured him more wine. She'd meant to tell him eventually, but the timing was never right. In the first year, she was too busy establishing the company's foundation. In the third year, she was worried he'd feel emasculated by her success. By year 5, the secret had become so massive that revealing it would feel like admitting to a betrayal. But wasn't the secrecy itself a form of betrayal? Jennifer had warned her back in grad school, "Secrets this big become walls, but walls keep people out and you locked in." Standing now at the company gala with divorce papers in her hand, but her husband walking toward his secretary, Rebecca understood her friend's wisdom too late. The day after the gala, Rebecca sat in Thomas Wu's downtown office at 6 a.m. sharp, but her eyes were red from a sleepless night, spent reading and rereading divorce documents. Thomas Wu was 43, impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit, but his expression carried the concern of a friend rather than just an attorney. He'd been Rebecca's lawyer since Vanguard's incorporation, but he was one of only 3 people who knew R.M. Sutton's true identity, the others being Jennifer and Rebecca's mother. "I've drafted 3 different approaches," Thomas said, but he slid the folders across his mahogany desk with visible reluctance. "But before we discuss strategy, I need to ask, how much does Jacob know?" "Nothing," Rebecca said, but the word tasted bitter. "He thinks I live off my grandmother's inheritance. He has no idea I own Vanguard, no idea his salary comes from my company, no idea that everything he has exists because I built it." "And Amanda Pierce?" Thomas asked, but he was already pulling up her employment file on his laptop. "Jacob's secretary," Rebecca said, but her voice cracked slightly on the title. "They've been having an affair for 18 months. He's leaving me to marry her." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional composure. "I've reviewed her file. She's 26. Been with Vanguard for 2 years. Excellent performance reviews from Jacob specifically, but no notable achievements beyond managing his calendar and expenses." "So she's using him to climb the corporate ladder," Rebecca said, but the observation brought no satisfaction. "Appears that way," Thomas confirmed, but he pulled up financial records that made Rebecca lean forward. "But there's something interesting here. 6 months ago, Amanda opened an account at Merrill Lynch with an initial deposit of $85,000. Her salary is $68,000 annually, but this deposit was made in cash." "Jacob's been giving her money," Rebecca said, but her mind was calculating. "Money from his salary, my money funneled through my husband, given to his mistress." "Technically, it's community property until the divorce is final," Thomas said, but his tone suggested he found the situation as galling as she did. "But yes, effectively she's been funded by your company, while simultaneously working to replace you." Rebecca stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking downtown Seattle, but the morning sun felt harsh rather than illuminating. Below, thousands of people were starting their workdays, fighting traffic, grabbing coffee, living normal lives, but she'd never been normal and never would be. "Option 1, Thomas said, but his voice drew her back to the conference table. "We handle this quietly. You grant the divorce, split assets according to Washington state law, which means Jacob gets 50% of what he believes you own, approximately $25 million from your grandmother's inheritance. He walks away wealthy enough to start over with Amanda. You maintain your anonymity, continue running Vanguard, move on with your life." "He betrayed me and gets $25 million, Rebecca said, but her tone was sharper than she'd intended. "It's clean," Thomas said, but he was already opening the second folder. "Option 2, you reveal everything. Announce that you're R.M. Sutton, that you own Vanguard, that Jacob has been working for you all along. The divorce becomes a media spectacle, but you destroy his credibility completely. Nobody in corporate America will hire him after that humiliation. However, you also expose yourself to scrutiny, your methods, your secrecy, the potential questions about why you hid your identity for a decade." Rebecca shook her head, but she knew option 2 was too blunt. "And option 3? Thomas smiled, but it was the expression of a chess master seeing 3 moves ahead. "Option 3 is more creative. We restructure Vanguard's leadership publicly, announcing that the mysterious R.M. Sutton is stepping back from active management, but appointing a new visible CEO. You under your married name, Rebecca Morrison. We spin it as Sutton recognizing your brilliance and handing you the reins. Nobody knows you're the same person." "That doesn't address Jacob," Rebecca said, but she was already seeing the possibilities. "Not yet," Thomas agreed, but he pulled out a third document. "But once you're publicly the CEO of the company Jacob works for, you have legitimate grounds to review all personnel. Jacob's performance reviews are mediocre at best. He's been coasting on the salary you arranged for him. Amanda's been padding her expense reports, small amounts, but technically embezzlement. We document everything, present it to the board that serves at your pleasure, and they fire both of them for cause." "You want me to fire my husband?" Rebecca asked, but the idea had a poetic symmetry. "Not while he's your husband," Thomas corrected, but his strategy was more sophisticated than that. "We let the divorce proceed for exactly 60 days, enough time for Jacob to feel secure, maybe even celebrate publicly with Amanda. Then, on day 61, you're announced as the new CEO. On day 63, the board reviews personnel issues. On day 65, both Jacob and Amanda are terminated for performance and ethical violations." Rebecca returned to her chair, but her mind was racing through implications. Jacob would suspect I orchestrated it. He'd fight back. "With what?" Thomas asked, but his question was rhetorical. "He has no evidence of your connection to Sutton. Every incorporation document, every patent, every financial record leads to shell corporations and offshore trusts that would take years to unravel. By the time he could prove anything, the divorce would be final, his career would be destroyed, and you'd have moved on." "It's ruthless," Rebecca said, but she wasn't rejecting the idea. "It's strategic," Thomas countered, but he was echoing her words from a decade ago. "And it protects what you've built, while delivering appropriate consequences for his actions." Rebecca stared at the 3 folders, but option 3 called to her with the seductive logic of perfect revenge. Jacob wanted to leave her for a younger woman. Fine. But he'd discover that the comfortable life he was abandoning wasn't his to walk away from. It was hers, but he'd never realized he was a guest in his own existence. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, but his expression turned serious. "If we do this, you need to be absolutely certain. Once you reveal yourself as Vanguard CEO, even under the fiction of being Sutton's successor, you'll face scrutiny you've avoided for a decade. Questions about your qualifications, your age, your gender. The tech press will investigate your background, but they'll find your Stanford doctorate and published papers. So that's solid. Wall Street will question whether Vanguard can maintain its trajectory under new visible leadership, but your track record speaks for itself. What you're asking, Rebecca said slowly, but she was processing the implications, is whether I'm ready to stop hiding. Exactly, Thomas confirmed, but his voice was gentle. You built Vanguard because you wanted to avoid the discrimination that crushed Melissa Huang. But times have changed. There are women CEOs now, not many, but enough that you won't be a complete anomaly. The question is whether the revenge against Jacob is worth stepping into the spotlight. Rebecca thought about the Rebecca Chen who'd sat in that Stanford lab 10 years ago, but who'd been afraid to claim credit for her own brilliance. She thought about the compromise she'd made, building an empire but remaining invisible, and whether that compromise had cost her more than she'd gained. She thought about Jacob's face last night as he handed her divorce papers, but the contempt in his voice when he'd called her a trust fund baby who'd never worked. Do it, she said, but her voice carried a finality that surprised even her. Option 3, all of it. Thomas nodded, but he was already pulling out his phone. I'll start the paperwork. The restructuring announcement will take 2 weeks to prepare properly. The divorce will proceed normally during that time. Don't give Jacob any indication you're planning something. Be sad, be hurt, be whatever he expects you to be. That won't be difficult, Rebecca said, but the pain was real even if her helplessness was feigned. I loved him, Thomas. I built all of this partly for him, so he could have a good life without the pressure of being the primary breadwinner, and he's throwing it away for a woman half his age who sees him as a stepping stone. Then let's make sure that stepping stone crumbles under his feet, Thomas said, but his tone was grim with purpose. I'll need you to document everything, every conversation with Jacob, every interaction with Amanda if you have any, every piece of evidence that demonstrates their affair and its impact on your marriage. The divorce attorney I'm bringing in is named Catherine Valdez, and she's brilliant but ruthless. Good, Rebecca said, but she was already standing to leave. I want ruthless. The next 2 months were carefully orchestrated theater, but Rebecca played her role perfectly. She moved out of the home she'd purchased with her own money, though Jacob believed it was from her inheritance, but took only her personal belongings and left him everything else. She rented an apartment downtown, something modern and soulless that reflected her emotional state, but spent most evenings working from the office she'd secretly maintained at Vanguard's headquarters for years. The office was on the executive floor but listed in building directories as R.M. Sutton, private, and therefore everyone avoided it religiously. Inside, Rebecca could monitor every aspect of her company's operations, but more importantly, she could watch Jacob and Amanda's relationship blossom with the bitter fascination of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. They weren't subtle, but arrogance rarely is. Rebecca accessed security camera footage, technically legal since she owned the building, but morally questionable in ways that no longer concerned her. She watched Jacob and Amanda kiss in the parking garage, but their passion looked performative, as if they were acting out a romance rather than living one. She watched Amanda show off her new Cartier bracelet, $12,000, Rebecca noted, which was exactly the amount of a consulting bonus that had appeared in Jacob's expense report 2 weeks earlier. He was spending company money on his mistress, but the irony was that company money was Rebecca's money, which meant Jacob was buying gifts for his new girlfriend using his wife's resources. Catherine Valdez, the divorce attorney, was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation destroying unfaithful spouses in court, but her methods were so effective that most cases settled before trial. Your husband's an idiot, Catherine said at their first meeting, but her bluntness was refreshing. He served you papers at a public event with hundreds of witnesses. He's openly flaunting his relationship with his subordinate, which could constitute sexual harassment, even if she claims it's consensual. And he's commingling marital assets with his mistress. This case would be easy even without your ace in the hole. The ace being Vanguard, Rebecca said, but Catherine shook her head. The ace being that you have the patience to let him hang himself, Catherine corrected, but she was reviewing expense reports Rebecca had provided. We're not going to mention Vanguard in the divorce proceedings. As far as the court is concerned, you're exactly who Jacob thinks you are, a woman with a $50 million trust fund who's been wronged by her ambitious husband. We'll ask for spousal support, not because you need it, but because it will enrage him. You want him angry? Rebecca asked, but she trusted Catherine's experience. I want him stupid, Catherine clarified, but her smile was predatory. Angry people make mistakes. I want him so focused on the divorce that he doesn't notice what's happening at his job until it's too late. The strategy worked perfectly, but watching it unfold was emotionally devastating, despite Rebecca's planning. Jacob hired a mediocre attorney named Richard Chen, no relation, but spent most of his time complaining about Rebecca's greed to anyone who would listen. The fact that she was asking for $8 million in the settlement, a fraction of what she actually owned, but claiming it was necessary to maintain her lifestyle, drove him to distraction. She never worked a day in her life, Jacob ranted to Amanda within earshot of the office cameras Rebecca monitored, but his delusion was almost impressive in its completeness. Now she wants me to support her forever? I'm not paying that woman another dime beyond what the law requires. You're so strong, Amanda cooed, but Rebecca could see the calculation in her eyes, even through grainy security footage. Standing up to her like this. Most men would just cave. What Amanda didn't know, but would discover soon enough, was that Rebecca didn't need Jacob's money, but the principle of making him fight over spousal support while she secretly controlled his entire professional existence was too perfect to resist. Thomas Wu worked parallel miracles on the corporate side, but his machinations were invisible to everyone except Rebecca and the board members who thought they were following R.M. Sutton's instructions. The restructuring is ready, Thomas informed her on day 45 of the 60-day plan, but his smile suggested he was enjoying this as much as she was. We'll announce it on day 61 exactly as planned. I've prepared your biography, everything true and verifiable, from your Stanford doctorate to your published papers, to consulting work you did early in your career. The narrative is that Sutton was impressed by your work and has been grooming you for leadership for years. Will people believe it? Rebecca asked, but she was reviewing the press release on her laptop. The tech press will question it initially, Thomas admitted, but he'd anticipated this. We'll have letters of recommendation from MIT professors, testimonials from other tech CEOs you've advised anonymously, documentation of patents you filed under your own name for smaller innovations. The story holds up because it's mostly true. We're just obscuring your connection to Sutton. And Jacob? Rebecca asked, but she already knew the answer. Won't hear about it until it's public, Thomas said, but his satisfaction was evident. The announcement will go out on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, you'll be giving interviews. By Tuesday, Jacob will be watching his wife, ex-wife technically, since the divorce will be final by then, revealed as the CEO of the company he works for. He'll panic, Rebecca said, but she was imagining his face. He'll definitely panic, Thomas agreed, but he pulled out another folder. Which brings us to the termination documents. Gerald Patterson will present them to the board on Wednesday, along with documentation of performance issues and expense report irregularities. The board will vote unanimously, since you control every seat, to terminate both Jacob Morrison and Amanda Pierce for cause. No severance, Rebecca asked, but she wanted to hear it stated clearly. No severance, Thomas confirmed, but his tone was firm. Termination for cause means they leave with nothing but their personal belongings. Jacob's salary stops immediately. Amanda's as well. Both will be escorted from the building by security, with all access revoked. Rebecca closed her eyes but imagined the scene with crystal clarity. Jacob packing his desk, confused and humiliated. Amanda realizing the man she'd hitched her wagon to was falling rather than rising. Security guards hired by her company following her orders, watching them leave. "Is this evil?" she asked suddenly, but the question surprised both of them. Thomas considered carefully, but his answer was thoughtful. "Is it evil to fire underperforming employees who've been misusing company resources? No. Is it evil to divorce a husband who betrayed you? No. Is it evil to reveal your success to a man who belittled you? No. You're not destroying Jacob's life, Rebecca. You're withdrawing the support you secretly provided for years. He'll still have his health, his education, his experience. He just won't have the cushion you created." "But I'm orchestrating it," Rebecca pressed, but she needed to hear herself say it. "I'm not just reacting, I'm planning his downfall step by step." "You're being strategic," Thomas said, but he was echoing her own words again. "The same way you've been strategic about building Vanguard, about protecting your identity, about everything you've accomplished. Jacob and Amanda made choices to betray you, to misuse company resources, to assume they could discard you without consequences. You're simply ensuring those consequences arrive." Rebecca nodded, but she didn't feel entirely absolved. Revenge, even justified revenge, but it tasted different than she'd expected. Not sweet, but bitter with the aftertaste of a marriage that had died without her noticing until the funeral. On day 59, Jacob texted her, "Divorce is final tomorrow, you can stop calling me." She hadn't called him in weeks, but the message revealed his guilty conscience more than anything else. She typed back, "I hope you're happy with Amanda, you deserve each other." He didn't respond, but she hadn't expected him to. On day 60, Catherine Valdez called with news. "Divorce is finalized. Judge granted you $6.2 million in the settlement, less than you asked for, but Jacob thinks he won because it wasn't the full $8 million. He's celebrating with Amanda at Canlis tonight, dropping $500 on dinner. I know because his lawyer inadvertently mentioned it." "Of course he is," Rebecca said, but she felt nothing. The money was trivial, but the symbolism of Jacob celebrating the end of their marriage, with another woman using funds from the settlement, cut deeper than she'd anticipated. "Tomorrow morning," Catherine said, but her voice carried anticipation. "He's going to regret every choice he made." On day 61, Rebecca Morrison woke at 5 a.m., but she'd barely slept. Today she would stop being invisible, but the prospect terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The press release went out at 8 a.m. Pacific time, but it had been carefully coordinated with every major tech publication, business network, and financial news service. Vanguard Technologies announces leadership transition. Mysterious founder R.M. Sutton steps back, names Dr. Rebecca Morrison as CEO. The accompanying article was masterfully written, but based on the narrative Thomas had constructed, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, 38, has been named Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Technologies, the $5 trillion quantum computing powerhouse that has revolutionized artificial intelligence over the past decade. Morrison, who holds a doctorate in AI from Stanford University and has consulted for numerous Fortune 500 companies, has worked closely with the company's reclusive founder, R.M. Sutton, for years. In a rare statement, Sutton said, "Rebecca Morrison is the most brilliant technologist of her generation, but her vision extends beyond code to understanding how technology can transform humanity. I've been preparing her to lead Vanguard for years, and I'm confident the company will reach new heights under her leadership." Morrison's appointment makes her one of the youngest CEOs of a major technology company and one of the few women leading a company of Vanguard's scale. The article continued with details of Rebecca's academic achievements, her early career innovations, and testimonials from other tech leaders Thomas had cultivated over the years, but every word was designed to establish her credibility while obscuring her connection to Sutton. By 8:30 a.m., Rebecca was trending on Twitter, but the reactions were mixed. Finally, a woman CEO at a major tech company. About time. One tweet read, but it had 45,000 likes. Who is Rebecca Morrison and why haven't we heard of her before? Seems suspicious, another said, but the skepticism was expected. Checked her credentials: Stanford AI doctorate, multiple patents, published papers in Nature. She's legit, a tech journalist tweeted, but Thomas's preparation was paying off. By 9 a.m., Rebecca was sitting in a television studio preparing for her first interview with CNBC, but her hands trembled slightly as the makeup artist applied powder to reduce shine. "You're going to be great," Thomas said from the green room, but his confidence didn't entirely calm her nerves. "Remember, you're not revealing anything about Sutton's identity. You're the protege who earned this position. Stick to that narrative." The interview went better than Rebecca expected, but the anchor, Sarah Richards, was professional and prepared. "Dr. Morrison, Vanguard has been an enigma for years, largely because of its founder's secrecy. Can you tell us anything about R.M. Sutton?" "I can tell you that Sutton is the most visionary person I've ever worked with," Rebecca said, but the truth of that statement made lying easier. "But Sutton values privacy, and I respect that. What matters is the work we're doing at Vanguard, pushing the boundaries of what artificial intelligence can achieve while maintaining ethical standards." Some critics suggest this transition means Sutton is losing faith in the company, Sarah pressed, but Rebecca had anticipated this. "On the contrary," Rebecca said, but her smile was confident. "Sutton is transitioning to a chairman role, focusing on long-term strategy while I handle day-to-day operations. This allows the founder to focus on the biggest questions. What comes after quantum computing? How do we ensure AI benefits humanity, while I ensure Vanguard executes excellently?" By 10 a.m., Vanguard's stock price had jumped 12%, but investors were responding positively to the clarity of having a visible CEO rather than a mysterious founder. By 11 a.m., Jacob Morrison was sitting in his office at Vanguard's Seattle headquarters, but his world was crumbling around him. He'd seen the announcement on his phone during his commute, but initially dismissed it as irrelevant to his position. A new CEO meant nothing to a mid-level marketing director, but then he'd seen the name, Rebecca Morrison. It couldn't be the same Rebecca Morrison, but as he frantically Googled, her face appeared on every major news site. His ex-wife, divorced literally yesterday, was the new CEO of the company he worked for, but the implications were too vast to process immediately. "Did you see this?" Amanda burst into his office, but her face was pale with panic. "Your ex-wife is the CEO? How is that possible?" "I don't know," Jacob said, but his mind was racing. "She's never even mentioned Vanguard. How could she go from a trust fund baby to CEO of a trillion-dollar company overnight?" "Maybe Sutton hired her," Amanda said, but she was scrolling through articles on her phone. "It says here she's been working with Sutton for years. Did you know that?" Jacob shook his head, but he was reviewing every conversation he'd had with Rebecca over the past decade. She'd never mentioned consulting for Vanguard specifically, but she'd mentioned consulting generally, and he'd never asked for details because he'd been too absorbed in his own career. "This is bad," Amanda said, but stating the obvious wasn't helpful. "If she's the CEO, she could fire you. Fire both of us." "She wouldn't," Jacob said, but he didn't sound convinced. "The divorce is final. She has no reason to focus on me anymore." He was so spectacularly wrong, but he wouldn't realize it for another 2 days. By noon, Rebecca was fielding congratulatory messages from tech leaders she'd advised anonymously for years, but revealing her identity now meant accepting credit she'd previously deflected. Sheryl Sandberg's message read, "I knew R.M. Sutton had excellent judgment when we consulted on Meta's AI ethics board. Congrats on your appointment. You've earned it." The irony that Cheryl didn't know she was congratulating Sutton directly, but only Rebecca as Sutton's supposed successor, made the message bittersweet. Jennifer Lee, her friend from Stanford, called at 1 p.m. "You did it. You actually did it. How does it feel to finally step into the light?" "Terrifying," Rebecca admitted, but she was in her new office, the one labeled Chief Executive Officer rather than R.M. Sutton, private. And the view of Seattle's skyline from the 47th floor was the same she'd always had, but felt different somehow. But also liberating. "I spent 10 years hiding, Jen, but I'm realizing now that invisibility was its own kind of prison." "What about Jacob?" Jennifer asked, but her tone suggested she'd been following the news. "He knows I'm CEO as of this morning," Rebecca said, but she was watching his office on her security monitors, a habit she'd need to break now that her role was public. "He doesn't know I own the company, doesn't know I'm Sutton, doesn't know he's about to be fired, but he will." "I know you're hurt," Jennifer said carefully, but she'd been Rebecca's conscience for years. "But make sure this is about justice, not just revenge. There's a difference." "Is there?" Rebecca asked, but the question was genuine. "He betrayed me, Jennifer. He spent 18 months lying to my face, then divorced me in public to marry his secretary. Now he's going to discover that everything he had was because I gave it to him. But I'm taking it back. If that's revenge, maybe revenge is just delayed justice." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, but her response was thoughtful. "Maybe it is. Just don't lose yourself in the process." After they hung up, Rebecca sat alone in her office, but the weight of what she'd done and what she was about to do pressed down on her. She'd crossed a line this morning by stepping into the spotlight, but there was no going back now. Tomorrow, Gerald Patterson would call an emergency board meeting, but Wednesday, Jacob and Amanda would be terminated. The plan was in motion, but Rebecca felt like she was watching it happen to someone else. Tuesday morning, Jacob requested an emergency meeting with Gerald Patterson, but he was told the CEO was unavailable. He was meeting with the board and the mysterious founder, R.M. Sutton, to discuss the transition. What Jacob didn't know was that Rebecca was in that board meeting, but conducting it in her new role as CEO, while simultaneously participating via video as Sutton. Thomas had set up sophisticated video manipulation technology that allowed her to appear as two people in the same meeting, though none of the board members knew they were talking to the same person. "The transition is proceeding smoothly," Rebecca said in her normal voice from her CEO chair, but her voice modulator played through speakers as Sutton's deeper, masculine-sounding tone. "Dr. Morrison has exceeded even my expectations. Vanguard is in excellent hands." The board members nodded, but they were relieved that both their mysterious founder and their new visible CEO seemed aligned, unaware that alignment was guaranteed when both people were the same. "There is one matter requiring immediate attention," Rebecca continued in her normal voice, but she slid documents across the conference table. "Our audit team has identified several concerns regarding personnel performance and expense report irregularities. I'm recommending we address these issues immediately to establish a culture of accountability under the new leadership." Gerald Patterson reviewed the documents, but his eyes widened when he saw the names: Jacob Morrison, Senior Marketing Director, and Amanda Pierce, Executive Assistant. The documentation was damning: expense reports padded with personal purchases, performance reviews that didn't match actual output, evidence of a romantic relationship between a supervisor and subordinate that violated company policy. "These are serious violations," board member Caroline West said, but she was a former federal prosecutor who'd joined Vanguard's board 2 years ago. "Termination is appropriate, but are we certain about the evidence?" "Completely certain," Rebecca said, but she'd spent 60 days ensuring every allegation was documented and irrefutable. "Mr. Morrison has been underperforming for 3 years. His marketing campaigns have consistently underdelivered on engagement metrics, and his department has the highest turnover rate in the company. Ms. Pierce has submitted expense reports that include personal purchases totaling $47,000 over 18 months, claiming they were business-related when documentation proves otherwise. What Rebecca didn't mention was that Amanda's expense fraud had been funded partly by Jacob's complicity. He'd approved reports he should have questioned, but either he was negligent or complicit, and either way, it was grounds for termination. "I move that we terminate both employees effective immediately," Gerald said, but he was following the script Rebecca had provided, with no severance given the termination is for cause. The vote was unanimous, but Rebecca abstained on principle. She couldn't vote to fire her ex-husband without revealing their connection, so she'd arranged for the board to have enough votes without her. "Security will handle the terminations tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Rebecca said, but her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she'd just orchestrated. "I want this handled professionally but firmly. Both employees will be escorted from the building immediately, with all access revoked." After the meeting, Thomas appeared in her office, but his expression carried both admiration and concern. "You're really doing this?" "I really am," Rebecca confirmed, but she felt strangely empty rather than triumphant. "There's no walking this back," Thomas warned, but he was giving her one last chance to reconsider. "Once they're fired tomorrow, Jacob will know you orchestrated it. He'll be furious, he'll fight back, he'll try to damage your reputation." "Let him try," Rebecca said, but her resolve was solid. "Everything we did was legal and justified. He can be as furious as he wants, but he can't change the fact that he betrayed me and then discovered he'd been living in a house I built." Wednesday morning at 8:45 a.m., Rebecca watched on her monitors as security personnel approached Jacob's office, but she'd positioned cameras to capture the entire scene without being present herself. Jacob was on a phone call with a potential client when the knock came, but his face shifted from concentration to confusion when two security guards entered accompanied by HR Director Michelle Torres. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to end your call," Michelle said, but her tone was professional, yet firm. "We need to speak with you immediately." Jacob hung up, but his expression was wary. "What's this about?" "Effective immediately. Your employment with Vanguard Technologies is terminated," Michelle said, but she was reading from a script HR had prepared under Rebecca's guidance. "You're being dismissed for cause due to sustained underperformance and irregularities in expense report approvals. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings, but you must leave company property immediately thereafter." The color drained from Jacob's face, but his first instinct was denial. "This is insane. I've been with Vanguard for 7 years. You can't just fire me without warning." "Your performance has been documented for 3 years, Michelle said, but she handed him a folder containing the evidence. "Multiple warnings were issued, but your metrics have not improved. Additionally, you approved expense reports for your assistant that contained fraudulent charges. Whether you were aware of the fraud or negligent in your oversight, either circumstance violates company policy." "This is Rebecca," Jacob said suddenly, but rage was replacing shock. "She's the new CEO, and she's firing me because of the divorce. This is retaliation." "Dr. Morrison did not vote on your termination," Michelle said, but the statement was technically true, even if it obscured Rebecca's role in presenting the case to the board. "The board voted unanimously to end your employment based on documented cause. You have no legal recourse." 2 floors down, Amanda Pierce was receiving an identical conversation, but her termination was even more clear-cut given the expense report fraud. She burst into tears immediately, but security was unmoved. "You're making a mistake," Amanda said through sobs, but her desperation was palpable. "I've done nothing wrong." You submitted fraudulent expense reports totaling $47,000, Michelle repeated. She was handling both terminations simultaneously with different security teams. That's embezzlement, Ms. Pierce, but Vanguard has decided not to press criminal charges if you leave peacefully. If you contest this termination, we will involve law enforcement. The threat of criminal prosecution ended any resistance, but Amanda's tears turned to rage as she realized her career and her relationship with Jacob had both been built on sand that was washing away. By 9:30 a.m., both Jacob and Amanda were in the parking garage, but their personal belongings were in boxes and their access badges had been deactivated. They found each other near their cars, but the reunion was not romantic. "This is your fault," Amanda hissed at Jacob, but her carefully cultivated sweetness had evaporated. "You said your wife was nobody, just some rich girl who inherited money. You didn't mention she was actually a tech genius who becomes CEO of your company." "I didn't know," Jacob shouted, but his world was spinning. "She never told me anything. How was I supposed to know she'd been hiding this whole other life?" "Well, congratulations," Amanda said bitterly, but she was getting into her car, a BMW Jacob had helped her finance with his now terminated salary. "You left your wife for me, lost your job because of it, and now you've got nothing. Neither of us do." She drove away without looking back, but Jacob stood in the parking garage alone, trying to process the cascade of consequences that had destroyed his life in 72 hours. Upstairs, Rebecca watched the security footage, but she felt no triumph. She'd expected to feel vindicated, powerful, satisfied with justice served, but instead, she felt hollow. Jacob was hurt and angry and ruined, but she'd loved him once, and destroying someone you loved, even someone who'd betrayed you, didn't feel like winning. "It's done," Thomas said from her office doorway, but he could see her emotional state. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, but honesty seemed appropriate now that the performance was over. "I thought this would feel different, better, but I just feel empty." "That's probably healthy," Thomas said, but he sat across from her. "You're not a cruel person, Rebecca, but you did what needed to be done. Jacob and Amanda made choices that had consequences. You simply ensured those consequences arrived." "Did I, though?" Rebecca asked, but she was questioning her own actions now that the moment had passed. "Or did I manipulate events to maximize their suffering? There's a difference between letting consequences happen and engineering them." Thomas considered this, but his answer was thoughtful. "You revealed the truth. You stopped hiding your accomplishments. You enforced company policies that protected Vanguard from underperforming and fraudulent employees. Everything you did was defensible. The fact that it also punished Jacob for his betrayal doesn't make it wrong. It makes it both just and personal." The tech press had a field day with the story, but the narrative evolved in unexpected ways. "Vanguard's new CEO fires her ex-husband for cause," read one headline, but the article suggested Rebecca was establishing her authority by refusing to tolerate mediocrity even in her personal life. "Rebecca Morrison's first week, clean house or vindictive?" asked another, but the opinion was split between those who saw her actions as justified and those who thought she'd abused her power. Rebecca gave no interviews about Jacob's termination, but she issued a brief statement through Vanguard's PR team. "Personnel decisions are made based on performance and conduct, not personal relationships. Vanguard maintains the highest standards for all employees, regardless of their connections." The statement was bland and corporate, but it deflected attention from her personal motivations while reinforcing that the terminations were justified. Jacob, meanwhile, was drowning in consequences but refusing to go quietly. He hired an attorney, a better one this time, but filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Vanguard, claiming the firing was retaliation for his divorce from Rebecca. The suit demanded $20 million in damages, but it was built on sand because the evidence against him was overwhelming. "We'll destroy his case in discovery," Catherine Valdez told Rebecca. She was now representing both Rebecca personally and Vanguard Corporate in the litigation. His performance reviews are abysmal. His expense report approvals of Amanda's fraudulent charges are documented. He's got nothing but his wounded pride. "How long will this take?" Rebecca asked, but she was tired of the whole situation. 6 months to a year, Catherine estimated, but her confidence was solid. "But honestly, I expect his attorney will advise him to drop it once they see our evidence. No jury will sympathize with a man who was cheating on his wife while working for a company, then got fired for legitimate performance issues after she became CEO." The prediction proved accurate, but not before Jacob gave a disastrous interview to a business podcast that went viral for all the wrong reasons. "Rebecca Morrison is vindictive and manipulative," Jacob said on the podcast, but his bitterness was evident. "She pretended to be this simple, trust fund wife while apparently running a secret tech career, then used her new position to destroy me professionally for leaving her personally. It's an abuse of power." The interviewer pressed him. "But weren't you having an affair with your assistant? And weren't there documented performance issues with your work?" Jacob stumbled but tried to deflect. "My personal life is irrelevant to my job performance, and the performance issues were exaggerated. Rebecca's people manufactured evidence to justify my termination." The problem was that Rebecca's people hadn't manufactured anything, but within hours of the podcast airing, tech journalists had obtained his performance reviews through sources at Vanguard, and the documents confirmed everything Rebecca's team had claimed. Jacob Morrison's claims debunked. Records show years of underperformance, read the follow-up headlines, but the narrative had shifted decidedly against him. On Reddit, the discussion was brutal but cathartic for Rebecca to read. Guy cheats on his wife, finds out she's actually a tech genius who became CEO of his company, gets fired for legitimate reasons, then claims she's abusing her power. The audacity, 14.3K upvotes. Imagine being so mediocre that your wife has to secretly give you a job at her company, then divorcing her for your secretary and acting surprised when you get fired. 22.K upvotes. Rebecca Morrison is my hero. She built a $5 trillion company in secret, supported her husband's career for years, got betrayed, and still handled his termination through proper channels with documented cause. That's not revenge. That's professionalism. 31.7K upvotes. The public opinion had turned definitively in Rebecca's favor, but she took no satisfaction from it. She'd never wanted to be a public figure, had never sought attention or validation from strangers, but the spotlight was unavoidable now. 3 months after the terminations, Jacob's lawsuit was quietly dropped, but his attorney had advised him that continuing would only result in more public humiliation and potential liability for legal fees. Jacob issued no statement but simply disappeared from the tech world entirely. Rebecca heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Portland, but was working as a marketing consultant for small businesses, a humiliating come-down from his position at Vanguard. Amanda had moved back to her hometown in Ohio, but her career in tech was effectively over since her termination, for fraud followed her everywhere. "Do you ever regret it?" Jennifer asked during one of their regular phone calls, but her question was gentle rather than judgmental. Rebecca thought carefully, but her answer was honest. "I regret that it came to that. I regret that Jacob turned out to be someone who'd betray me. I regret that I spent 10 years hiding who I was because I was afraid of discrimination. But do I regret firing 2 employees who were underperforming and defrauding the company? No. Do I regret revealing my success to a man who belittled me? No. I regret the circumstances that made those actions necessary, but not the actions themselves." "That's a mature perspective," Jennifer said, but her tone carried approval. You're not pretending to be vindictive, but you're also not pretending you didn't enjoy parts of it. I enjoyed the justice, Rebecca admitted, but she was in her office overlooking Seattle as the sun set. I enjoyed watching someone face consequences for their actions, but I didn't enjoy the pain, not his, not mine, not the whole messy situation. Revenge is supposed to feel good, but mostly it just feels finished. 2 years later, Rebecca Morrison was on the cover of Forbes with the headline, "The CEO Who Was Always There," but the article explored her unique path to leadership. The profile was balanced. It covered her Stanford doctorate, her decision to remain anonymous for years to avoid discrimination, her successful tenure as Vanguard's public CEO, but it also addressed the controversy around her ex-husband's termination. "I've learned that visibility has costs and benefits," Rebecca told the Forbes interviewer, but her perspective had evolved. "I spent years hiding because I was afraid of being dismissed as a woman in tech, but that fear cost me pieces of my personal life. I couldn't share my achievements with my husband because I was so focused on protecting my anonymity. In retrospect, maybe if I'd been more open, things would have been different." "Do you think the discrimination you feared was real or imagined?" the interviewer asked, but it was a fair question. "Both," Rebecca said, but her answer was thoughtful. "Research shows that women CEOs face more scrutiny, more skepticism, higher standards, but I used that as an excuse to avoid taking the risk. Other women have succeeded publicly in tech. Sheryl Sandberg, Susan Wojcicki, Safra Catz. They faced challenges I would have faced, but they did it anyway. I took a different path, and it worked professionally, but cost me personally." Under her public leadership, Vanguard had launched 3 new product lines but expanded into healthcare AI and climate modeling in addition to quantum computing. The company's market value had grown to $7.2 trillion, but Rebecca's visible leadership had attracted talent that R.M. Sutton's anonymity never could. "People want to work for a leader they can see," Gerald Patterson told her during a strategy meeting, but he'd become her most trusted advisor once he'd learned she was Sutton. "The mystery was intriguing, but you're inspiring. There's a difference." Rebecca had donated $500 million to programs supporting women in STEM fields, but she'd endowed scholarships at Stanford specifically for female doctoral students in computer science. She'd become an advocate for transparency in tech leadership, but argued that the industry needed to create conditions where women didn't feel they needed to hide to succeed. "I was both privileged and limited by my choices," she said in a TED Talk that went viral. "Privileged because I had the resources to build a company anonymously, but limited because I felt it was necessary. We need to build an industry where the next Rebecca Morrison doesn't feel like she needs to hide, but can build her empire with her name on it from day one." As for her personal life, Rebecca had started dating again, but cautiously. She'd learned that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, were corrosive to intimacy, but she'd also learned that her success wasn't something to apologize for or hide. "I'm looking for someone who celebrates my achievements rather than feeling threatened by them," she told Jennifer during a rare girls' weekend in Napa. "And if that person doesn't exist, I'm perfectly fine building my life alone. I've learned I don't need someone to complete me. I'm already complete." Jennifer raised her wine glass in a toast, but her smile was proud. "To the woman who was always there, but now everyone can see." Rebecca touched her glass to Jennifer's, but her reflection in the wine seemed to shimmer with all the versions of herself she'd been. The scared Stanford student, the anonymous founder, the betrayed wife, the vindictive CEO, but ultimately just a woman who'd built something remarkable and finally claimed credit for it. But Rebecca herself had moved beyond the narrative others constructed about her life. But she was focused on building Vanguard's future rather than reliving her past. The company that had been her secret was now her public legacy, but the transformation from invisible owner to visible leader had been painful and necessary, and ultimately liberating. She'd learned that power hidden is power diminished, but that revelation is risk and risk is growth. She'd learned that revenge, even justified revenge, but ultimately provides less satisfaction than simply living well and openly. She'd learned that the woman she'd been, brilliant but afraid, capable but hidden, had evolved into someone stronger precisely because she'd stopped hiding. And sometimes, late at night in her office overlooking the city she'd helped transform through technology, Rebecca would think about Jacob and wonder if he'd learned anything from their story. She hoped he had, but hoped he'd found some peace in Portland with his small consulting clients and his humbled ambitions. She didn't hate him anymore. Hate required more energy than he deserved, but she'd moved into indifference, which was perhaps the truest form of moving on. The divorce papers he'd handed her at that company gala 2 years ago were framed in her private study at home, but not as a trophy, as a reminder that the worst moments of our lives often become the catalysts for our greatest transformations, but only if we're brave enough to stop hiding and start building in the light. Rebecca Morrison had built an empire in shadows, but she was maintaining it in sunlight, and that made all the difference.